Behind the golden gates of one of England's most prestigious palaces, where protocol reigns supreme and every gesture is scrutinized by the world, a moment of raw human emotion shattered the carefully maintained facade. What happened that autumn afternoon when Queen Camilla's composure finally cracked would become the most talked-about palace incident in decades, a story that revealed the intense pressure, hidden struggles, and unexpected heroism that exists behind the crown. This is not just another royal scandal. This is the untold story of a woman pushed beyond her breaking point, a dedicated guard who risked everything to do what was right, and how one explosive moment changed the dynamics of the monarchy forever. The events that unfolded would challenge everything the public thought they knew about life inside the palace walls, proving that even royalty are painfully, beautifully human. The morning of October 15th began like any other at Clarence House, with the soft rustle of silk curtains being drawn back and the gentle clink of fine china as morning tea was prepared. Queen Camilla sat at her mahogany writing desk, reviewing the day's schedule that her private secretary had meticulously arranged. The autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet that had witnessed decades of royal conversations and decisions. Margaret Thornfield, Camilla's longtime lady-in-waiting, noticed the tension in her mistress's shoulders as she moved through the room, organizing papers and correspondence. There was something different about Camilla's demeanor that morning, a tightness around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. The past few weeks had been particularly challenging, with a series of public appearances, charity galas, and state functions that had left little time for rest or personal reflection. The first sign of trouble came during the morning briefing with Sir Jonathan Pemberton, the palace's communications director. He arrived with a stack of newspapers and a grim expression that immediately set everyone on edge. The headlines were brutal, focusing on a minor protocol breach from the previous week's state dinner that had been blown completely out of proportion by the media. "Your Majesty," Sir Jonathan began carefully, his voice measured and professional, "we need to discuss the media response to last week's dinner. There are some concerns about the seating arrangements and the conversation with the ambassador's wife." Camilla's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she listened to the recap of events that had already been dissected by royal correspondents across the globe. The criticism centered on what was essentially a moment of genuine human connection, where she had comforted the ambassador's wife who was dealing with a personal family crisis. The media had somehow twisted this act of kindness into a breach of diplomatic protocol. As the morning progressed, the pressure continued to mount. A phone call from the palace's senior advisors brought news of additional scheduling conflicts that would require her to cancel a long-planned private lunch with old friends. Another call informed her that a charity close to her heart was being investigated by journalists looking for any hint of impropriety, despite the organization's impeccable track record and transparent operations. By midday, Camilla's usual grace was beginning to show cracks. Staff members noticed her shortened responses and the way she gripped her teacup a little too tightly. Lady Margaret tried to suggest a brief rest, but Camilla waved off the concern with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The afternoon brought Prince William for what was supposed to be a casual family visit, but even this became another source of stress when palace protocol demanded that their private conversation be conducted in the formal drawing room rather than the more comfortable family quarters. William could see the strain his stepmother was under and tried to keep the conversation light, but the formal setting made genuine relaxation impossible. During their tea, palace staff continued to interrupt with urgent matters that required immediate attention. A florist needed approval for arrangements for an upcoming state visit, the head chef required menu changes due to dietary restrictions for visiting dignitaries, and the palace security team needed to discuss modifications to travel plans for the following week's engagements. Each interruption chipped away at Camilla's composure, and William found himself increasingly concerned about her well-being. He had seen this kind of pressure affect his own family members before, and he recognized the warning signs of someone approaching their breaking point. However, palace protocol made it difficult for him to address his concerns directly, and their conversation remained frustratingly superficial. The breaking point came just as William was preparing to leave. Sir Jonathan returned with news that a major newspaper was planning to run a story questioning Camilla's fitness for her role, based on anonymous sources within the palace. The story would appear in the morning edition, giving them little time to prepare a response. As Sir Jonathan outlined the newspaper's claims, Camilla's face grew increasingly pale. The allegations were baseless but devastating, suggesting that she was struggling with the demands of royal life and that her emotional state was affecting her ability to perform her duties effectively. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room that the very pressure that was causing her stress was now being used as evidence of her supposed inadequacy. William watched in growing alarm as his stepmother's hands began to tremble slightly. The confident, dignified woman who had handled decades of public scrutiny and criticism was finally showing the human cost of carrying such enormous responsibility. Palace life, with its constant surveillance and endless demands, had worn down even her considerable resilience. The conversation in the drawing room became increasingly tense as Sir Jonathan and other advisors discussed damage control strategies. They spoke about Camilla as if she weren't in the room, debating the best way to present her image to the public and minimize the impact of negative coverage. The dehumanizing nature of these discussions, treating her more like a public relations problem than a person, only added to her growing agitation. As the afternoon wore on, more staff members arrived with additional crises that needed immediate attention. A security breach at another royal residence required policy changes, a diplomatic incident involving a minor member of the royal family needed careful handling, and preparations for the upcoming state visit were falling behind schedule due to logistical complications. Lady Margaret tried several times to suggest that perhaps some of these matters could be handled the following day, but she was overruled by senior advisors who insisted that everything required the Queen's immediate attention. The lack of consideration for Camilla's emotional state or basic human needs became increasingly apparent as the day dragged on without even a proper meal break. By evening, the drawing room had become a command center of sorts, with advisors, secretaries, and staff members coming and going with barely controlled panic about the next day's newspaper story. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and everyone could sense that something was about to give way under the enormous pressure. The final straw came when Sir Jonathan suggested that Camilla should consider making a public statement about her commitment to her royal duties, essentially forcing her to defend herself against attacks that had no basis in reality. The suggestion that she needed to prove her worthiness for a role she had been fulfilling with distinction for years finally pushed her past her limits. The room fell silent as everyone recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The woman who had maintained her dignity through decades of public scrutiny, who had transformed herself from a controversial figure into a respected member of the royal family, was finally reaching the end of her emotional endurance. The very people who were supposed to support and protect her had instead contributed to a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. As darkness fell outside the tall windows of Clarence House, the stage was set for an explosion that would reverberate through the palace walls and ultimately change how everyone understood the human cost of royal duty. The explosion came without warning, like a sudden thunderclap on a clear day. Sir Jonathan's suggestion that Camilla should publicly defend her fitness for royal duty hung in the air like a match dropped into gasoline. For a moment, the drawing room was completely silent except for the gentle ticking of an antique clock that had witnessed countless royal conversations over the decades. Then, with a force that stunned everyone present, Camilla's composure finally shattered. Enough. The word escaped from her with such intensity that several people physically stepped backward. Her voice, usually so controlled and measured, cracked with a combination of rage, frustration, and deep hurt that had been building for months. I have given everything to this role, everything, and you want me to grovel before the press like some guilty schoolchild. Sir Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but Camilla continued, her words pouring out like water through a broken dam. Years of suppressed emotions, countless moments of biting her tongue in the face of unfair criticism, and the accumulated weight of impossible expectations all came rushing to the surface at once. Do you have any idea what it's like? She demanded, her hands shaking as she gestured toward the newspapers scattered across the mahogany table. To have every gesture analyzed, every word dissected, every human moment turned into evidence of your unworthiness? I comforted a grieving woman, showed basic human decency, and, somehow that becomes a diplomatic incident? Lady Margaret moved instinctively toward her, but Camilla was beyond comfort now. The pain in her voice was raw and unmistakable, revealing the profound isolation that came with her position. She had spent years building walls around her emotions, maintaining the perfect facade that royal life demanded, and now those walls were crumbling in spectacular fashion. I was told when I married into this family that I would never be good enough, she continued, her voice rising with each word. That the public would never accept me, that I would always be seen as the other woman, the interloper. And, I accepted that. I worked harder than anyone to prove myself, to earn my place, to show that I could serve with dignity and grace. The room remained frozen as Camilla's outburst continued. Palace staff who had worked with the royal family for decades had never witnessed anything like this raw display of emotion from someone in her position. The carefully maintained protocols and professional distance that governed palace life suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of such genuine human anguish. But, it's never enough, is it? Her voice cracked with emotion as years of accumulated pain spilled out. No matter what I do, how many charities I support, how many hands I shake, how many times I smile while people dissect my every move, it's never enough. I'm always one mistake away from being declared unfit, always one human moment away from being crucified in the press. Prince William, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, found himself in an impossible position. He wanted to comfort his stepmother, but palace protocol made such personal intervention complicated. He could see the genuine anguish in her eyes and recognized that this was far more than just a momentary loss of temper. This was the culmination of years of pressure that had been building without adequate support or outlet. Sir Jonathan tried again to interject, perhaps to offer some sort of damage control solution, but Camilla turned on him with fierce intensity. "Don't you dare try to manage this moment," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Don't you dare treat my breakdown as another public relations problem to be solved with the right words and careful positioning." The truth in her words hit everyone present with uncomfortable force. That was exactly what they had been doing, treating her emotional distress as a crisis management situation rather than recognizing the human being who was clearly in pain. The machine of palace life, with its endless focus on image and public perception, had somehow lost sight of the people at its center. "I have sacrificed everything for this role," Camilla continued, her voice becoming stronger even as tears began to flow. "My privacy, my spontaneity, my ability to simply be human without it being analyzed and judged. I've given up friendships because they might cause complications, missed family moments because of duty, and smiled through more criticism than most people could imagine." The room was thick with tension as everyone grappled with the reality that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern royal history. The woman they had all worked to protect and support was revealing that their very efforts had sometimes contributed to her isolation and pressure. The system designed to uphold the monarchy was, in some ways, failing the people within it. As Camilla's anger reached its peak, her voice echoing off the ornate walls of the drawing room, several staff members exchanged worried glances. There was genuine concern not just about the immediate situation, but about what might happen next. Royal outbursts were not unprecedented in history, but they were extraordinarily rare in the modern era, and no one quite knew how to handle such a raw display of emotion from someone in her position. "You want me to make a statement about my commitment?" she asked, her voice heavy with bitter irony. "Here's my statement. I have been more committed to this role than I have been to my own well-being, more dedicated to royal duty than to my own happiness, more concerned with serving the crown than serving myself. And, apparently, that's still not enough." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, London continued its normal rhythm, completely unaware of the drama unfolding within the palace walls. Inside the drawing room, everyone struggled to process what they had just witnessed and what it might mean for everyone involved. Lady Margaret finally stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should take a break and continue these discussions tomorrow. But, Camilla wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and years of suppressed frustration continued to pour out. "Do you know what the cruelest part is?" she asked, looking around the room at the faces staring back at her. "It's that I genuinely love this role. I love the charity work, I love meeting people, I love being able to make a difference. But, loving something that seems determined to destroy you, piece by piece, is a special kind of torture." Her words hung in the air like an accusation, challenging everyone present to confront the reality of what royal life actually demanded from those who lived it. The romantic notions about privilege and glamour seemed hollow in the face of such genuine anguish and emotional exhaustion. As Camilla's outburst reached its crescendo, the door to the drawing room opened quietly, and James Sullivan, one of the palace guards, stepped inside to deliver what he thought was routine security information. Instead, he found himself witnessing the most dramatic scene of his 5-year career protecting the royal family. The timing of his arrival would prove to be crucial, though no one in that emotionally charged moment could have predicted how his presence would change everything that followed. James Sullivan had been a palace guard for 5 years, long enough to understand the unwritten rules that governed his interaction with the royal family. He was trained to be invisible when necessary, professional always, and to maintain the careful distance that palace protocol demanded. But, nothing in his training had prepared him for what he encountered when he stepped into the drawing room that evening. The scene before him was unlike anything he had witnessed during his time at the palace. Queen Camilla stood in the center of the ornate room, her usually perfect composure completely shattered, tears streaming down her face as she confronted the assembled advisors and staff members. Her voice, raw with emotion, filled the space with a pain that was almost tangible. James's first instinct was to quietly withdraw and return later, but something about the scene stopped him. Perhaps it was the expression of genuine anguish on the Queen's face, or maybe it was the way the other people in the room seemed frozen, uncertain how to respond to such an unprecedented display of human emotion. Whatever the reason, he found himself unable to simply walk away from someone who was clearly in distress. The security briefing he had come to deliver suddenly seemed trivial in comparison to what was unfolding before him. As a former military man who had served in Afghanistan before joining the palace security team, James had seen people at their breaking point before. He recognized the signs of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits and was now experiencing the kind of emotional collapse that required immediate and compassionate intervention. What struck him most forcefully was how alone Queen Camilla appeared, despite being surrounded by people whose job it was to support her. The advisors and staff members seemed more concerned with damage control and protocol than with the obvious fact that she was having what could only be described as a mental health crisis. Their professional detachment, while probably well-intentioned, was clearly inadequate for addressing the human need that was so apparent in the room. As Camilla's voice continued to crack with emotion, James made a decision that would define not only his career but also his understanding of what true service meant. Instead of retreating or waiting for someone else to take action, he stepped forward, his military training kicking in as he recognized a situation that required immediate de-escalation. "Your Majesty," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension with a gentleness that surprised everyone in the room. "Perhaps you might benefit from some fresh air. The gardens are particularly beautiful this time of evening." The simplicity of his suggestion was shocking in its contrast to the complex discussions of public relations strategies and damage control that had dominated the afternoon. Here was someone offering a basic human solution to human distress, recognizing that sometimes the most sophisticated problems required the most straightforward remedies. Camilla turned toward him, and, for a moment their eyes met across the formal space of the drawing room. In that instant, James saw not a queen or a public figure, but a woman who was drowning in expectations and desperately needed someone to throw her a lifeline. The recognition was mutual. She saw in his face not judgment or calculation, but simple human concern. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is not appropriate. I shouldn't be, this isn't how things are done." James took another step forward, his movement careful and non-threatening but purposeful. "Your Majesty," with respect, sometimes the most important thing is not how things are done, but what needs to be done. And, right now, it seems like you need a moment to breathe. His words cut through the formal atmosphere of the room like a knife through silk. Here was someone acknowledging the obvious reality that everyone else had been dancing around, that protocol and procedure were sometimes inadequate for addressing basic human needs. The courage it took for a guard to speak so directly to a member of the royal family was not lost on anyone present. Sir Jonathan started to object, clearly uncomfortable with the breach of protocol that James's intervention represented. "This is highly irregular," he began, but James gently but firmly cut him off. "With respect, sir, what's irregular is allowing someone to reach this level of distress without addressing it directly," James replied, his military background evident in his ability to remain calm under pressure while still asserting his position. "Sometimes following protocol means recognizing when the protocol itself is part of the problem." The statement was revolutionary in its implications, suggesting that the very systems designed to protect and support the royal family might sometimes work against their well-being. It was a perspective that could only come from someone with an outsider's view of palace life, someone who wasn't so embedded in the culture that they couldn't see its potential flaws. Prince William, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern for his stepmother, found himself impressed by the guard's intervention. Here was someone willing to risk his career to address a situation that everyone else was treating as a public relations problem rather than a human crisis. The contrast between James's direct approach and the advisor's calculated responses was stark and revealing. "James," Camilla said softly, remembering his name from the countless times he had provided security during her public appearances. "That's very kind of you, but I'm afraid there are matters that require immediate attention." "Your Majesty," James replied with gentle firmness, "the most urgent matter in this room right now is your well-being. Everything else can wait 20 minutes while you get some air and collect yourself. The world will not end if a few decisions are delayed." His practical approach to the situation was refreshing in its simplicity, but it also represented a fundamental challenge to the way palace life operated. The suggestion that anything could wait, that the endless stream of urgent matters might not actually be as critical as they seemed, was almost heretical in a world where every moment was scheduled and every decision was treated as monumentally important. Lady Margaret stepped forward, recognizing the wisdom in James's suggestion. "He's quite right, Your Majesty. A brief walk in the gardens might be exactly what you need." But it was James's next action that truly demonstrated his understanding of the situation. Instead of waiting for further discussion or debate, he simply moved toward the French doors that led to the private gardens, opening them to let in the cool autumn air. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, offering a literal and figurative escape from the suffocating atmosphere of the drawing room. "The roses are particularly lovely this time of year," he said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather with a friend rather than addressing a member of the royal family during an emotional crisis. "And there's a bench by the fountain that's quite peaceful." His casual tone was exactly what the situation needed, offering normalcy in the midst of chaos and treating Camilla as a human being rather than a royal problem to be managed. The approach was so different from everyone else's response that it created a moment of clarity in the emotional storm. For the first time in hours, Camilla smiled slightly, recognizing the genuine kindness in his offer. Here was someone who wasn't trying to fix her or manage her or protect the institution from her humanity. He was simply offering her the basic consideration that any person in distress deserved. The transition from the suffocating formality of the drawing room to the open air of the private gardens was like stepping from underwater into sunlight. As Camilla walked through the French doors that James had opened, she felt the cool autumn air against her tear-stained face and experienced the first moment of genuine relief she had felt in weeks. The gardens at Clarence House were her personal sanctuary, a place where she had spent countless hours finding peace among the carefully tended roses and ancient oak trees. This evening, with the golden light of sunset filtering through the leaves and the gentle sound of water trickling from the central fountain, the space seemed to offer exactly the healing she desperately needed. James followed at a respectful distance, close enough to provide security but far enough to give her privacy. His presence was reassuring without being intrusive, and, for the first time all day, Camilla felt like she could breathe without someone analyzing her every gesture or word. The contrast between his simple, human approach and the calculated responses of her advisors was profound and illuminating. As they walked along the gravel path toward the fountain, Camilla found herself speaking, not in the formal tones required by her position, but in the natural voice of someone sharing her thoughts with a trusted friend. "You know, James," she said softly, "there are days when I wonder if I'll ever be enough for this role, no matter how hard I try." James walked beside her, matching her pace and listening without judgment. "If I may say so, Your Majesty, from what I've observed over the past 5 years, you've been more than enough. The problem isn't your adequacy, it's that the expectations placed on you are often unreasonable and, sometimes impossible." His honest assessment was exactly what she needed to hear, not the careful flattery that usually surrounded her, but a genuine evaluation from someone who had witnessed her work firsthand. James had seen her comfort grieving families at charity events, watched her handle difficult diplomatic situations with grace, and observed her genuine care for the people she served. They reached the stone bench by the fountain, and Camilla sat down heavily, as if the weight of the day was finally catching up with her. The sound of flowing water was soothing, a natural melody that helped wash away the harsh voices and criticism that had been echoing in her mind for hours. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could simply exist without performing. "I've been thinking about resigning," she said quietly, the admission shocking even herself. "Walking away from all of this before it destroys what's left of my sanity and self-worth." James sat down beside her, maintaining appropriate distance while still offering the comfort of his presence. "That would be a tremendous loss," he said simply. "Not for the institution, but for all the people whose lives you've touched and improved." His response surprised her with its focus on impact rather than duty or obligation. While her advisors always spoke about her responsibilities to the crown and the importance of maintaining royal traditions, James was highlighting the human connections that made her work meaningful. It was a perspective that reminded her why she had chosen this life in the first place. "You really think I make a difference?" she asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. "Your Majesty, I've been with you to dozens of events over the past 5 years, James replied. "I've seen you hold the hand of a mother who lost her child, spend an extra hour with elderly veterans sharing their stories, and personally ensure that a homeless shelter received the funding it needed. The media might focus on protocol and politics, but the people whose lives you touch see something very different." As he spoke, Camilla began to remember why she had fallen in love with royal service despite its challenges. The work itself was deeply fulfilling when she was allowed to focus on it without the constant barrage of criticism and second-guessing that had consumed recent weeks. James's reminder helped her reconnect with her sense of purpose. "The hardest part," she said, watching the water flow over the fountain's carved stones, "is feeling like I'm constantly being measured against an impossible standard. Diana's memory, the public's expectations, the media's need for drama, sometimes it feels like I'm drowning in other people's opinions about who I should be." James nodded thoughtfully. "In the military, we had a saying, you can't control the mission parameters, but you can control how well you execute. You can't control what people expect or what the media writes, but you can control how authentically you serve and how genuinely you care." The wisdom in his words was striking in its simplicity. While everyone else had been focused on managing perceptions and controlling narratives, James was suggesting that the real answer lay in simply being true to herself and her genuine desire to serve. It was advice that cut through all the complexity and politics to reach the heart of what really mattered. As they sat together in the peaceful garden, Camilla found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she had kept locked away for years. The isolation of royal life, the constant pressure to be perfect, the way criticism could cut deeply even when it was unfounded or unfair. James listened without trying to fix anything, offering the rare gift of simply being heard and understood. "You know what the strangest thing is," she said after a long moment of comfortable silence. "In there, surrounded by all those advisors and staff members whose job it is to support me, I felt completely alone. Out here, with just you, I feel more supported than I have in months." The observation was a damning indictment of how the machinery of royal support could sometimes become so focused on protecting the institution that it lost sight of the people within it. James's simple act of treating her as a human being rather than a royal problem had provided more comfort than all the careful strategies and damage control discussions. "Sometimes the most helpful thing isn't solving someone's problems," James replied. "Sometimes it's just acknowledging that the problems are real and that the person dealing with them isn't wrong for struggling." His insight revealed a deep understanding of human nature that was rare in the palace environment. While others had been trying to minimize her distress or find quick solutions, James was validating her experience and recognizing that her emotional response was not only natural but completely justified given the circumstances. As the evening light faded and the garden grew quieter, Camilla felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The crisis wasn't solved, the newspaper story would still appear tomorrow, and the pressures of royal life would continue. But, for this moment, she felt anchored and supported in a way that reminded her of her own strength and resilience. "James," she said finally, "thank you. Not just for tonight, but for reminding me that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the simplest truths." He smiled, his expression warm and genuine. "Your Majesty, if I've learned anything from my time here, it's that the best service isn't about following rules perfectly. It's about recognizing when someone needs help and having the courage to provide it, even when it means breaking protocol." His words would prove to be prophetic, as the events of that evening would indeed break protocol in ways that would reverberate through the palace for months to come. But, in that moment, as they sat together in the sanctuary of the garden, both of them understood that sometimes breaking the rules was exactly what was needed to serve something more important than tradition. The walk back to Clarence's house felt different from the journey out to the gardens. Where before Camilla had been fleeing the suffocating atmosphere of crisis management and protocol, she now returned with a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing for months. The 20 minutes spent in James's straightforward company had provided more perspective than hours of strategic discussions with her advisors. As they approached the French doors leading back to the drawing room, Camilla paused, gathering herself for what she knew would be a difficult but necessary conversation. The advisors would still be there, the newspaper story would still be a concern, and the pressures of royal life would continue. But, something fundamental had changed in her understanding of how to navigate these challenges. "James," she said, turning to face him in the doorway. "What you did tonight was extraordinary, and I want you to know that it won't be forgotten." He nodded respectfully, but she could see in his expression that he was concerned about potential repercussions for his intervention. Palace protocol was sacred to many people, and his decision to directly address a royal crisis would likely be viewed as overstepping his bounds by some of the senior staff. When they entered the drawing room, the scene was exactly as they had left it, with Sir Jonathan and the other advisors huddled around the mahogany table discussing damage control strategies. The contrast between the peaceful clarity of the garden and the anxious energy of the formal room was stark, highlighting the difference between addressing problems and simply managing their appearance. "Sir Jonathan," Camilla said, her voice now steady and purposeful. "I need to speak with you privately." The room quickly emptied except for the communications director, Prince William, and Lady Margaret. James began to withdraw as well, but Camilla stopped him with a gentle gesture. "Actually, James, I'd like you to stay. What I have to say concerns everyone who was here tonight." Her request was highly unusual, but the events of the evening had already shattered normal protocol, and everyone recognized that they were in uncharted territory. James remained by the door, uncertain about his role but honored by her trust in including him in what would clearly be an important conversation. "Tonight showed me something crucial about how we've been handling the pressures of royal life," Camilla began, her voice carrying the authority that came from hard-won wisdom. "We've become so focused on managing perceptions and controlling narratives that we've forgotten the most important thing, serving with authenticity and genuine purpose." Sir Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but Camilla continued with gentle firmness. I appreciate everything you do to protect and support me, but I realize now that some of our approaches have been counterproductive. When we treat every human moment as a potential crisis, when we respond to criticism by trying to prove our worth rather than simply doing good work, we create the very problems we're trying to avoid. Prince William watched his stepmother with growing admiration as she articulated a philosophy that he had been struggling to express himself. The pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness or humanity, was something that affected every member of the royal family, and Camilla's willingness to address it directly was both brave and necessary. What happened tonight wasn't a failure of protocol or a crisis that needs managing, she continued. It was a reminder that we're all human beings trying to do important work under extraordinary pressure. And, sometimes the most helpful response is simply acknowledging that reality instead of trying to hide from it. Lady Margaret smiled slightly, recognizing the return of the strong, confident woman she had known for years. The emotional breakdown had been difficult to witness, but it had ultimately led to this moment of clarity and renewed purpose. Sometimes breaking down was necessary before building back up stronger. James, Camilla said, turning toward the guard who had changed the entire trajectory of the evening. Your intervention tonight wasn't just helpful, it was exactly what leadership looks like. You saw someone in distress and responded with courage and compassion, even though it meant risking your career to break protocol. James stood straighter, both proud of the recognition and still somewhat amazed at how the evening had unfolded. Your Majesty, I just did what seemed right in the moment. Exactly, she replied. You responded to what was needed rather than what was expected. That's a principle I want to apply to how we approach royal service going forward. The conversation that followed would reshape how Clarence House operated, with new emphasis on authentic engagement over careful image management. Camilla implemented regular private time for reflection and planning, reduced the number of daily briefings that added stress without adding value, and established new protocols for staff to raise concerns about workload and pressure. More importantly, she decided to address the newspaper story not with defensive statements about her fitness for royal duty, but with a thoughtful piece about the realities of public service and the importance of supporting each other through challenges. The response was honest without being self-indulgent, strong without being defensive. The newspaper story, when it appeared the next morning, was largely overshadowed by Camilla's proactive and authentic response. Rather than seeming defensive or embattled, she appeared thoughtful and grounded, someone who understood both the privileges and responsibilities of her position. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with many people expressing appreciation for her honesty about the challenges of public life. More significantly, the evening's events led to broader changes in how the palace approached mental health and well-being for all staff and family members. Camilla became a passionate advocate for recognizing that serving others effectively required taking care of oneself first, a message that resonated far beyond the palace walls. James's role also evolved in the months that followed. While he remained a security officer, he was also asked to provide input on staff well-being and became an informal advocate for palace employees who might be struggling with the unique pressures of royal service. His military background and natural empathy made him particularly effective in this role. The relationship between Camilla and James remained appropriately professional, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect that grew from that crucial evening in the garden. She had seen his courage in action, and he had witnessed her humanity in a way that deepened his commitment to protecting not just her safety, but her well-being. 6 months later, at a charity gala supporting mental health awareness, Camilla spoke publicly about the importance of recognizing when support is needed and having the courage to both ask for help and offer it to others. While she didn't reference the specific events of that October evening, those who had been present understood the personal experience behind her words. James stood at his usual post during the event, watching as she connected genuinely with guests and spoke passionately about causes she cared deeply about. This was the woman he had recognized that evening in the drawing room, someone whose strength came not from perfection but from authenticity and genuine care for others. The transformation that began with a moment of breakdown and continued with an act of courageous intervention had ultimately strengthened not just Camilla's approach to royal service, but the entire culture of support and care within the palace. Sometimes the most important moments are the ones that break us open, allowing light to enter and healing to begin. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Camilla caught James's eye across the room and nodded slightly, a gesture that conveyed more than words could express. They both understood that the real victory wasn't in avoiding crisis, but in how they had chosen to respond when crisis came. That October evening had changed both of their lives, proving that sometimes the most profound service comes not from following rules, but from having the courage to do what's right.